So, I want you to imagine just for a second that you are standing right in the center of like a colossal stadium.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah, and there are, 70,000 people all around you, and they are screaming with this intensity that, I mean, it almost feels solid, right? Like you can physically feel the noise.
Oh, absolutely. The kind that vibrates in your chest.
Exactly. The stadium lights are blinding, they're cutting through the night sky, and the bass from the massive speakers is literally vibrating straight up through the soles of your shoes.
It's a very specific, overwhelming kind of energy.
It really is. And down there on the stage, in the middle of all this chaos, is the biggest pop star on the entire planet.
Right.
Now, I want you to hold that specific image in your mind, because what if I told you that right in the middle of all that stadium glitter, amidst all the heartbreak anthems and the acoustic guitars, she has actually been secretly encoding hardcore 19th century Austrian psychoanalytic theory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and heavy existential philosophy into her lyrics for like her entire career.
I mean, honestly, it sounds like the kind of elaborate, completely caffeine-fueled theory you might stumble across at like 3 in the morning on a very obscure internet message board.
Right, it totally does. But that bizarre, completely fascinating premise is exactly what we are exploring today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you are joining us because, well, we are looking at a stack of notes today from a text that honestly feels kind of like a glitch in the matrix.
It really does. It's an excerpt from this highly unusual, almost rule-breaking book titled Fortnight, Freud Meets Taylor Swift.
Yeah, and we should mention this specific text is actually part of a much broader, highly ambitious project, right?
Right. It's called the Philo Swift Collection.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the author of this collection is just as enigmatic as the premise
Oh
itself.
my gosh, yes.
They published under this pseudonym, which is written in Taiwanese Mandarin as Us Yura.
Which translates to what
What
exactly?
translates to mouse-colored cat.
Mouse-colored cat. I mean, I cannot get over that pseudonym. It immediately sets a tone, doesn't it?
It really does. Because we have absolutely no idea who this person is. I mean, our source material mentions a few wild rumors circulating about their identity.
Yeah, like what are the theories?
Well, some say it might be a former programmer who turned into a corporate lawyer. Or
Mhm.
maybe like an itinerant philosopher just bouncing around between Brussels, Antwerp, and Krakow.
That is quite the range of professions.
Right. But the author themselves actually insist that all of that is just geographical camouflage.
Geographical camouflage. I love that.
Yeah, so what we do know, just based purely on their writing style, is that they have absolutely zero patience for, you know, lukewarm ideas
Hmm.
or predictable academic arguments.
Or cats without ambition, apparently.
Exactly. I mean, they have handed us this text that feels, well, it's part revision guide, part philosophical blind date, and honestly, part intellectual vandalism.
Intellectual vandalism. That is the perfect way to describe it. And, we should probably establish the stakes for you, the listener, right up front.
Yeah, yeah,
Because our mission today is not to, like, definitively prove that Taylor Swift spends her evenings poring over dusty original German translations of Sigmund Freud.
right. Or that she's up late analyzing Immanuel Kant.
Although, and I have to say this, the mental image of her writing a pop bridge while furiously highlighting a copy of the Critique of Pure Reason is
Oh,
incredible.
it's a fantastic visual.
Yeah.
But no, the real goal here is to explore the underlying mechanics of why pairing massive stadium status pop anthems with incredibly dense philosophy actually works so perfectly.
Yeah, we are going to challenge those invisible walls we build, the ones between what society deems high culture and what we just casually dismiss as our guilty pleasures.
Exactly. We're going to look under the hood of human desire, basically. And eventually, we're even going to tackle how human irrationality might actually be our most robust defense mechanism against the rise of artificial intelligence.
Which is a huge leap, but we will get there. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before the author even lets us anywhere near the Freudian psychoanalysis, they kind of force us to confront our own cultural conditioning.
Yeah, right in the preface.
Right. They essentially hold up a mirror to the reader, and to us, really, and point out that we are probably smirking at the title. They ask this very blunt question. Why does the idea of Taylor Swift and philosophy sitting at the same table make us instinctively smirk?
And that smirk, right there, is the actual entry point into their entire philosophical argument.
How so?
Well, to dismantle that smirk, the author brings in Pierre Bourdieu.
Okay. Remind me who that is.
He was a highly influential French sociologist, and he wrote a landmark book back in the late 1970s called Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste.
Right, distinction.
Yeah. And what Bourdieu argued, and what the author really leverages here, is that our tastes in art, in music, and literature, they are not these naturally occurring phenomena.
So it's not just like pure aesthetic preference.
Exactly. Societies smirk at pairing a pop star with a philosopher. It isn't actually about intellectual depth at all. It is a mechanism of social sorting.
Okay, let's drill down into that for a second. Because how does liking a certain type of music act as a social sorting mechanism? Are we talking about, like, putting people into hierarchical boxes based on what they consume?
That is the absolute core of it. Bourdieu introduced this really famous concept of cultural capital.
Cultural capital, right.
Yeah, so, we often think of capital only in terms of money, like economic capital.
Sure, dollars and cents.
But cultural capital is your knowledge, your mannerisms, your education, and your tastes. We have this culturally ingrained assumption that high culture, so say attending a Wagner opera or reading dense continental philosophy, is just inherently profound.
And it makes you look smart to other people.
Exactly. Conversely, we assume that low culture, or mass pop culture, is inherently shallow. But Bourdieu points out that this distinction is entirely an artificial construct. It's designed to maintain class boundaries.
So it's gatekeeping.
100% gatekeeping. Think about it. High culture circulates with academic credentials. It requires university syllabi, specialized jargon, and gatekeepers just to access it. Pop culture, on the other hand, circulates with Spotify playlists and radio airwaves. It is radically accessible.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, pop culture is considered suspect or lightweight by the intellectual elite simply because it spreads too widely.
Yes.
Like if millions of people can sing along to a chorus in a stadium, that piece of art can no longer be used as a snobbish status symbol to prove you are smarter or more cultured than the person next to you.
Exactly. If everyone has access to a piece of art, it cannot function as a tool for elevating one group above another. Therefore, the elite must declare it not deep.
Wow. Okay, that makes so much sense.
Right. And the author of our text argues that the questions compressed into a 3.5-minute pop song questions about the fragility of identity, the dynamics of power in a relationship, the unreliability of memory, the illusion of freedom. These are the exact same existential questions that have preoccupied thinkers in libraries for 25 centuries.
So you're saying it's the exact same dread?
The exact same dread. These are the same anxieties that kept Rousseau, Hannah Arendt, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein awake at night.
Okay, I am tracking with the sociological argument. Like, I get the social sorting thing, but I want to play devil's advocate here for a second and push back on the artistic side of it.
Sure, go for it.
Isn't pop music, just by its very design, inherently simpler? Let's use a culinary analogy.
Okay, I love a food metaphor.
Right. So if I go to a really good gourmet burger joint, the burger might be phenomenal. It might have like an artisanal brioche bun, house-made pickles, maybe a truffle aioli.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, but fundamentally, mechanically, it is still a burger. It is not a complex, multi-course, deconstructed, dry-aged steak dinner. So are we arguing that the burger is actually the steak just disguised? Because that feels like a stretch to me.
I see where you're going with the analogy, but the author would counter that you are actually confusing the complexity of the packaging with the nutritional value of the ingredients.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The distinction being made isn't about structural complexity at all. It's about the concept of permission.
Permission?
Yes. The author asserts that Taylor Swift is exploring the exact same existential dread that philosophers explore. The difference is, she does it in front of 70,000 people without asking permission from the academic establishment.
Ah, she doesn't have a PhD, so she didn't ask for the academic stamp of approval.
Exactly. She strips away the dense, alienating jargon. She doesn't use a 50-page thesis to make a point. She uses a bridge, a chorus, and a synth hook. And the text makes this beautiful observation here. It says, to simplify is to flatten, but to translate is to risk.
Oh, I like that.
Right. And risk is fundamentally democratic.
That distinction between simplifying and translating is really crucial, isn't it? Because when you translate dense human emotion into a 4-chord pop song, you are exposing it to everyone. You are risking misinterpretation by the masses, but you are also inviting everyone into the conversation.
Exactly. You are breaking down the gate.
And to really hammer home this idea of breaking down academic gatekeeping, the author does something incredibly audacious right at the beginning of the book.
Oh, the foreword.
Yes. They write a fake, apocryphal foreword, imagining it was penned by Taylor Swift herself.
Right. The section is titled Taylor's Way Apocryphal. And as a literary device, it serves to immediately strip away all of that academic distance we were just talking about,
It really sets a mood instantly. The text notes, it was imagined to be written at 2 a.m., somewhere between noise and silence.
which is such a vivid image.
It is. And in this fake forward, the imagined Swift reflects on her career. She talks about spending half her life trying to capture lightning in a bottle. She describes scribbling secrets in spiral notebooks, sitting on the floor in pajamas, basically trying to decode the mechanics of the universe.
Yeah, trying to figure out why time passes differently when you are newly in love and why it seems to stop dead, almost suffocating you when your heart is broken.
Which honestly touches on a very profound cultural critique that goes way beyond just music.
Definitely. The fake forward addresses the historical dismissal of adolescent female feelings as being, quote unquote, too much.
Oh, absolutely. Society has this long track record of framing teenage girls' emotions as too loud, too frequent, too melodramatic, and just inherently frivolous.
It's the classic double standard. I mean, think about it. If a middle-aged male philosopher writes a sprawling treatise on his existential despair and his total inability to connect with others.
We call it a masterpiece of the human condition.
Exactly. But when a 19-year-old girl writes a song about the exact same feelings of alienation and heartbreak, we call it a silly diary entry.
Yeah, it's so dismissive. And the narrator in this apocryphal forward talks about being told she just wrote breakup songs for teenage girls. As if adolescence isn't a time when you experience the world with, like, the violence and awe of a summer storm.
That's a great way to put it. She notes how she was constantly accused of playing the victim, of calculating too much, or conversely, of not calculating enough.
Right.
But behind all the media narratives, she was really just trying to document the human condition.
And this is where the text makes its really sharp philosophical pivot. This imagined Taylor suspects that behind all the stadium glitter, behind the celebrity rumors and the paparazzi flashes, we are all collectively asking the exact same terrifying questions that keep us awake after midnight.
The author poses these beautifully specific, piercing questions in this section.
Yeah, like why does the memory of a scarf left in a drawer weigh more heavily than an entire decade of your life?
Or, are we ultimately defined by the people who love us? Or are we shaped more by the people who leave?
Let's actually pause for a second and direct that question to you listening right now. Just think about your own internal life. How often do you dismiss your own intense emotions, your irrational fixations, your late-night anxieties as just being silly or overly dramatic?
Probably a lot.
Right. You tell yourself to snap out of it. But the author is pointing out that these messy, overwhelming feelings are the exact same existential dread that philosophers like Søren Kierkegaard dedicated their entire lives to analyzing.
I love how the book phrases it. It says, the ghosts haunting our hallways actually have university degrees.
That is such a strange but validating thought. The things we cry about in our cars are the exact same things being debated in ivy-covered halls.
It completely elevates the everyday human experience. The fake forward imagines Swift not just writing a catchy hook about a boy with blue eyes, but unknowingly debating with Plato about the nature of illusion versus reality.
Or arguing with Jean-Paul Sartre about how the gaze of others fundamentally alters our own identity.
Yes.
But I have to say, my absolute favorite line from this entire fake forward is the throwaway joke right at the end.
Oh, I know which one you're going to say.
The imagined Taylor says, apparently Kant loved the bridge in Cruel Summer.
It's so good.
Just the mental image of Immanuel Kant, right? The stern 18th century Prussian philosopher who wrote The Critique of Pure Reason, aggressively nodding his head to a pop synth bridge.
It's hilarious, but it also perfectly encapsulates the author's mission, seating the global pop star and the historical philosopher at the very same table, forcing them into dialogue, and then just waiting to see who spills their secrets first.
Exactly. It completely dismantles the reverence we usually reserve for these dense intellectual traditions.
And the author states explicitly that the goal of this book is not to condescendingly explain Taylor Swift using big words.
Right.
Nor is it to dumb down the philosophers. It is an intentional, high-speed collision.
So, having thoroughly established that a stadium pop song is a totally valid democratic vehicle for deep philosophy, let's zoom in on the specific pairing for this particular volume in the collection.
Let's do it.
We are looking at the song Fortnight from the album The Tortured Poets Department, and the author has paired this specific song with the father of psychoanalysis himself, Sigmund Freud.
And to understand why this pairing isn't just like a gimmick, but is actually incredibly precise, We really need to look at the bedrock of Freud's biography.
Right, because his background is kind of surprising.
It is. The text synthesizes this brilliantly. So Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, but he moved to Vienna when he was 4 years old and lived there for 78 years.
He essentially transformed that city into the world capital of the unconscious.
He really did. But here's the thing that a lot of people don't realize about him. He didn't start out analyzing dreams or having people lie on couches to talk about their mothers.
Right. I found this fascinating in the notes. He was a hard science guy initially. He was a doctor and a neurologist. The text specifically mentions he started his career dissecting and studying eels and nerve cells.
Yeah, literally dissecting eels. He was entirely grounded in 19th century empiricism. His early work was strictly biological, neurological, and anatomical. He was looking for the physical, material causes of human behavior.
So what changed? How did he go from eels to the unconscious?
Well, there was a massive turning point in his career and, honestly, in the history of psychology. Freud began encountering patients that traditional medicine of the era simply could not cure. And frankly, they were patients the medical establishment didn't want to deal with.
And the historical context here is really important, right? Because
Yeah.
these patients were almost entirely women.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
They were presenting with severe psychosomatic symptoms. At the time, this was all categorized under the broad, often very dismissive umbrella of hysteria. These women were paralyzed, but doctors could find absolutely no physical injury to the spine or the nervous system. They were functionally blind, but their optic nerves were perfectly healthy.
Mm.
They were mute, entirely unable to speak, without any biological reason.
Which must have been baffling for doctors at the time.
Totally baffling.
Yeah.
The medical establishment of bourgeois Vienna essentially just threw their hands up. Because they couldn't find a physical lesion or a germ, they often accused the women of faking it, or just being overly dramatic.
There's that phrase again, too dramatic.
Exactly.
But Freud looked at these exact same patients and realized something entirely revolutionary. He realized that the body was speaking a language that no one had bothered to learn how to translate.
Yes.
The paralysis wasn't fake. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological trauma.
He realized that when the mind cannot process a trauma, it converts that psychological pain into a physical symptom. The body literally becomes the canvas for the unconscious.
But wait, how did a guy who started out dissecting eels figure out how to translate the language of the unconscious? Because, I mean, there wasn't exactly a textbook he could consult.
No, he had to invent the textbook.
Yeah.
And he did it by, metaphorically speaking, lying down on the couch himself.
Self-analysis.
Exactly. The text details how Freud engaged in this grueling period of self-analysis. He conducted this primarily through a series of dizzying, incredibly intimate letters to his close friend, a physician named Wilhelm Flies.
He was just writing his stream of consciousness to his friend.
Pretty much. Through this intense, almost torturous introspection, peeling back his own psychological layers, he discovered the concepts that would define his legacy and change how we view human nature.
Things like what?
The Oedipus complex, the concept of repression, the lingering power of infantile sexuality.
And it is so vital to remember how society reacted to all of this. Because bourgeois Vienna absolutely hated these ideas.
They despised them.
Yeah.
The scandal was immediate and it was lasting. Freud was labeled an obsessive, a charlatan, and a pervert.
I mean, you have to picture late 19th century Victorian society. This was a culture entirely built on repression, politeness, and pristine outward appearances.
Exactly.
They did not want to hear a doctor tell them that their highly civilized lives were actually being secretly driven by chaotic, often sexual, deeply selfish urges that they formed when they were toddlers.
Nobody wants to hear that. But the author of our text notes that Freud had a very specific type of stubbornness. He had the stubbornness of a scientist who knows, without a shadow of a doubt, that they have stumbled upon a massive, undeniable truth.
Even if it's a truth that everyone else desperately prefers to ignore.
Right. He just kept working.
And that dedication to confronting ugly, uncomfortable truths remained with him until the very end of his life, didn't it?
It did. The text recounts his death in 1939 in London. He had been forced into exile by the rise of Nazism, fleeing his beloved Vienna.
Which is tragic in itself.
And furthermore, he was ravaged by a brutal form of jaw cancer that had tortured him for 16 years, requiring dozens of painful surgeries.
Oh, wow. 16 years of jaw cancer.
Yeah. And when the pain finally became unbearable, he didn't wait for the end. He actually chose it. He asked his doctor to administer a lethal dose of morphine.
And the author points out the profound poetry in this, right?
Yes. Freud died exactly as he lived, facing the harsh reality, refusing to look away, even when the truth was incredibly ugly.
It's a very intense, heavy biography. But from that intense life came a framework and a vocabulary that we now use every single day. And here is where the author's conceptual vandalism really shines.
Yes, the transition to the song.
Right. They take these heavy Freudian concepts and map them directly onto the aesthetic world of the song Fortnight.
And if you know the song or the music video, it heavily utilizes the imagery of neat, tidy, sterile white picket fence suburbs.
Which, the author argues, is the absolute perfect spatial metaphor for the architecture of the human mind.
It really is. The author breaks down the psyche into Freud's three famous components.
The id, the ego, and the superego.
Exactly, and places them directly into that suburban landscape as if they were literally neighbors.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's walk down the street of this Freudian suburb. First, we have the superego. The text gives us this striking image. The superego waters clean flowers. How do we unpack that?
Okay, so think of the superego as your internal censor. It is the internalized voice of society, of your parents, of morality, of religious rules, and most importantly, of guilt.
Guilt is a big one.
Oh yeah, it's the part of your psyche that desperately wants everything to look presentable. It wants to be socially acceptable and beyond reproach. So, watering clean flowers is the perfect metaphor. The superego is out in the front yard maintaining a pristine, socially approved outward appearance for all the neighbors to see.
Right. It's that voice in your head saying, look at my perfectly manicured garden. I am a well-adjusted, productive member of society.
Exactly.
But then lurking out back in the garden shed, we have the ided. And the text says, the id dreams of shears.
The id is the original primitive reservoir of our deepest, most selfish impulses. It is pure, unadulterated chaos.
It doesn't care about the neighbors at all.
Not even a little bit. It operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It wants everything, and it wants it now, without any regard whatsoever for consequences, logic, or social norms.
So if the superego wants to carefully nurture those neat little flowers to impress everyone, the id wants to take a pair of rusty shears and violently chop the entire garden to the ground just to see what it feels like.
That's it, exactly.
So you have the diligent gardener and the chaotic vandal forced to live inside the exact same house.
And caught constantly in the crossfire is the ego.
Right, the ego.
The ego is the exhausted, constant negotiator. It is the conscious self that has to navigate reality. It is caught between the relentless, unacceptable, chaotic desires of the id and the strict, punishing prohibitions of the superego.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. The text describes the ego's role in this suburb perfectly. It says the ego is, quote, pretending everything is fine behind the white picket fence.
The white picket fence, I love this part. The author spends a significant amount of time analyzing this fence. It's described as being on a cream-colored background, perfectly aligned, freshly painted.
Because it serves as the literal dividing line of the psyche.
Yes. It is the boundary that separates the acceptable from the unacceptable. But the author makes this brilliant, piercing observation here. Desire has never, ever respected fences.
Actually, the text suggests something even more subversive than that. It says desire prefers the dividing fence.
Wait, prefers it? Why?
Because the fence gives desire something to transgress against. The ego sets up that fence to create an illusion of control, right? To keep the chaos of the id safely contained in the yard.
Right, to keep things safe.
But desire slips between the wooden slats late at night when the superego is exhausted and asleep, and the id is out there gardening in silence.
It is such a vivid, tactile way to explain a century-old psychological model. But if the suburbs represent the spatial architecture of the mind, what is the actual dramatic event occurring in this specific song? Because Fortnight is explicitly about a 2-week relationship.
Right. And to understand the drama of those 2 weeks, we have to transition from how the mind organizes space to how the unconscious experiences time.
I am so glad we are getting into this because this addresses the core skepticism people always have. It's the contradiction that critics immediately point out when they hear a sprawling, devastating song about a 2-week relationship.
Yeah, they say it's an overreaction.
Exactly. A fortnight is literally just 14 or 15 days. So logically, how can a 2-week fling be elevated to this massive, world-ending, existential tragedy?
It seems completely disproportionate to the conscious mind. But the author introduces a foundational Freudian concept here to explain it. It's a concept referenced heavily in Freud's later work, specifically beyond the pleasure principle.
Okay, what is it?
It is called Wiederholungszwang.
Okay, German word, what does that translate to?
It translates to the compulsion to repeat.
The compulsion to repeat.
Yes. And the absolute key insight here is that the unconscious mind does not wear a watch. It does not own a calendar.
So it doesn't process time linearly.
Not at all. Conscious time is linear. It moves from past to present to future. Unconscious time is circular, or rather, it is always present. Therefore, 15 days is not just a brief period. 15 days is plenty of time for the unconscious to completely unspool and replay 20 years of poorly filed, deeply buried childhood scenarios.
Oh, wow. So you're not just reacting to the 15 days.
No, you are constantly driven to replay the same unresolved emotional patterns. We don't repeat them to fix them. We repeat them because the unconscious operates outside of calendar time. It only knows the intensity of the unresolved wound.
That makes so much sense, but I know people resist this idea. And to really illustrate how deeply resistant people are, the author actually scripts out a hypothetical dinner conversation between a cultural snob and a Swiftie.
Oh, this dialogue's brilliant.
I think we need to act this out a bit to capture the friction. Let's say we are at a pretentious dinner party. I will play the snob.
Okay, and I'll be the Swiftie.
All right, so I'm sitting there swirling an expensive glass of wine, and I scoff. I say, Fortnight. A 2-week adventure elevated to the rank of existential tragedy, please. We've seen more measured literary ambitions.
And as the Swiftie sitting across the table, I wouldn't get defensive. I would get analytical. I'd reply.
Yeah.
Freud built his entire psychoanalytic theory on the idea that duration is completely irrelevant. A dream that lasts 3 seconds in REM sleep can contain the emotional weight of an entire lifetime. A 15-day relationship can perfectly replay a 20-year-old trauma. It is not the duration that counts. It is the intensity of the symptom.
Okay, so the snob rolls her eyes at that, and I say, oh, come on, talking about symptoms for a brief summer fling is a bit grandiose, don't you think?
And I'd say, that is exactly the word Freud uses. The compulsion to repeat. We unconsciously fall back into the exact same dynamic, usually with the person wearing a different face, and our conscious mind genuinely believes each time that it is brand new. Fortnight isn't a song about a random fling. It tells the story of a woman who realizes this script has already been written, who knows the tragic ending before the beginning, and who steps into it anyway. It's not naivety. It is the id taking the car keys and driving, while the ego was looking the other way.
Now the snob gets visibly defensive, relying on, that intellectual gatekeeping, I say.
Yeah.
Reducing the mystery of love to a mere neurosis is typically Freudian and, frankly, typically reductive. You are trying to psychoanalyze a pop song. Freud would turn in his grave at the comparison.
And this is where the Swiftie delivers this historical knockout punch. I say, Freud psychoanalyzed Leonardo da Vinci based on a single fabricated childhood memory. He analyzed the biblical figure of Moses based on looking at a statue. And he diagnosed the origins of entire human civilizations based on a mythological murder in Totem and Taboo. A dense, repetitive 3-minute pop song that is practically overflowing with unsaid things and symbolic imagery is exactly Freud's favorite format. Besides, the fact that this specific song annoys you so much, don't you find your own resistance a little revealing?
Boom. I love that response so much. The idea that Freud needed decades of peer-reviewed data is a complete myth. He looked for the dense, symbolic moments where the unconscious slips out.
Exactly.
And to further explain why the calendar doesn't matter, the author brings in a fictional academic voice, a Professor Malak Merriwell, who offers this incredible archaeology analogy.
Professor Merriwell argues that if we want to understand human behavior, we have to entirely abandon the naive belief that duration determines psychological significance. The unconscious mind is not temporally organized like a timeline. It is stratified. It is layered. He uses the German term Altertumswissenschaft.
Altertumswissenschaft, okay.
Which is the study of antiquity, or essentially archaeology.
I think this is one of the most powerful metaphors in the whole text because imagine an excavation site somewhere like Rome or Troy. It has layers built up over thousands of years. When you walk around the surface, the modern city looks brand new.
Yes.
But if you start digging down, you realize something profound. The new city on top is structured by the exact same spatial logic as the ancient ruins buried underneath.
Yes. The alignments of the modern streets follow the paths of the ancient walls. The placement of the thresholds, where the doors open and close, are dictated by foundations laid millennia ago.
So the past is dictating the present.
Completely. The archaeologist digging in that dirt isn't discovering novelty. They're uncovering persistence. The past is literally shaping the present from beneath the surface.
The archaeologist does not discover novelty. He uncovers persistence. Let's apply this directly to you, listening right now. Think about that dizzying feeling when you meet someone new and you feel this insane, intense spark.
We all know that feeling.
Right, you feel like you are discovering an entirely new universe in this person. But Professor Merriwell's archaeological view says no. The partner is not discovered. He is unearthed.
Unearthed. And that unearthing is what explains the massive affective intensity of these very short relationships. It is not the shock of the new that knocks the wind out of you. It is the immense pressure of the already there.
They already there. That is heavy.
In Freudian terminology, this mechanism is called condensation. All the unresolved weight, all the anxiety, and all the desires of your past are instantly condensed and projected onto this brief 15-day encounter.
But wait, if we're just digging up old ruins, if we're just unearthing old psychological templates, what happens to the concept of romance? What happens to the idea that we have free will in who we love?
Well, this takes us to what I think is the darkest, most unsettling part of the book.
Yeah, it really is. The author includes a section formatted as a letter from a philosopher, which is essentially Freud writing a direct letter to a Swiftie.
And the tone of the letter is just devastating in its clinical clarity. It addresses the heartbreak directly, saying, "You believe this was a short story. It was not. What you experienced was not an encounter. It was a return. A structure already written, waiting for a body."
A structure already written, waiting for a body. I mean, I am struggling to accept how deterministic that is. It completely strips away the magic of finding a soulmate.
It absolutely challenges our most cherished, culturally ingrained illusions about romantic love. The letter goes on to dismantle the idea of agency, stating, "You think you chose him, but choice implies alternatives."
That is the line that stopped me in my tracks. Choice implies alternatives.
Right. It suggests that in these intense, repetitive, toxic cycles, there were no viable alternatives. The letter says, here there was only recognition, something familiar, but not remembered.
So it's not a choice.
No. And what's truly fascinating here is how the human brain fundamentally misinterprets this moment of recognition. When we encounter that familiar structure, we feel this intense urgency, this magnetic pull toward the person, and our conscious ego dresses it up in romantic language.
Right. We call it attraction.
We call it destiny. We say things like, "I feel like I've known you my whole life."
But Freud says, you haven't known them your whole life. You've known the trauma your whole life. It's not destiny. It is just repetition.
Yes.
The letter notes that repetition is never calm. It feels urgent because your unconscious is trying desperately yet again to resolve an emotional conflict from your past that was never successfully resolved.
And the truly tragic part of the compulsion to repeat, it fails again.
It almost always fails.
Because you're trying to solve a historical problem with a current person. That is why you keep going back to the same dynamic. Not because the person offers something new, but because the psychological task remains unfinished. The letter actually offers a chilling piece of advice for the heartbroken. It says, "Do not ask why him. Ask, where have I seen this dynamic before?"
To put it as bluntly as possible, the author includes a quote from another fictional commentator in the book, someone named Gaston Blunder.
Oh, this quote is brutal.
It sums up the entire Freudian romantic experience with brutal efficiency, he says. You didn't fall in love, you fell into the same hole with better lighting.
It is a harsh truth to swallow. And to ensure the reader fully grasps this, the book presents a multiple-choice quiz titled, "Who Wants to Win Nothing?"
Who wants to win nothing?
Yeah, it has a simple question. According to psychoanalysis, what is actually happening in the song Fortnight?
Okay, let's run through these options because I think dismantling the wrong answers organically helps clarify the right one. Let's say someone chooses option A. It's just a short but intense love story.
A psychoanalyst would say that is incorrect.
Yeah.
As Professor Merriwell pointed out with his archaeology analogy, if you choose option A, you're still measuring complex psychic phenomena with a calendar.
Right.
The calendar is merely decorative. The intensity isn't a property of the relationship being short. The intensity is the effect of the repetition.
Okay, what about option B? It is a bad romantic decision. A lot of people listening might lean toward this, like, I just made a bad choice, I ignored the red flags, I'll do better next time.
Also incorrect, because this is a moral interpretation. It is highly comforting to the ego to think we just made a bad choice, because that implies we have the conscious control to make a good choice next time.
Well, we don't.
Freud does not care about morality or error. He cares about psychic necessity. The subject doesn't choose badly. The subject repeats inevitably. The unconscious demanded that scenario.
What about option C? It was a new emotional experience.
Incorrect again. This answer falsely assumes that novelty is even possible at the deepest level of unconscious structures. It isn't. What feels fresh and new to the conscious mind is simply unrecognized repetition from the unconscious.
Which leaves us with the only correct answer, option D. It is a repetition of an unconscious pattern.
Correct. And selecting option D requires a massive shift in perspective.
Mm,
It displaces the analysis from the surface content. So, the specific guide, the literal 2 weeks, the suburban aesthetic, down to the underlying psychological structure.
got it.
In psychoanalysis, that movement from surface symptom to underlying structure is the only move that actually matters.
And to bring all of this dense structural theory to life, the author paints an incredibly cinematic, almost surreal scene. It is titled The Unlikely Taxi Ride.
This is such a cool visual.
I really want you to picture this. Imagine Taylor Swift and Sigmund Freud sitting in the back of an Uber together, sharing a 9-kilometer ride through quiet suburban streets at night. The streetlights are flashing rhythmically across their faces. Identical houses are passing by with the soft glow of televisions behind closed curtains. The silence in the car is heavy.
The dialogue the author scripts for them is sparse, but every single word is loaded with meaning.
What do they say?
Well, Swift looks out the window and says, "You say it lasted 2 weeks." And Freud, staring straight ahead, replies, "Of course not. Time is irrelevant here."
Swift admits to him, almost whispering, "It felt familiar." But I had never met him. And Freud delivers the core thesis of the entire book. He says, "You had met the structure. You didn't choose him. You recognized him."
And Swift says what every single one of us is thinking when we hear this theory. She says, "That sounds worse. It's less romantic."
Right.
And Freud, who was ever the clinical realist, doesn't comfort her. He simply agrees. It is less romantic, certainly.
She asks him why it feels so intensely painful if it's just a rerun. Freud tells her that repetition insists. What is unresolved returns with force. It demands to be felt. And as the car passes endless rows of identical white picket fences, there is that ego imagery again, trying to keep the chaos contained. Swift asks the ultimate heartbreaking question.
What's the question?
She asks, and next time.
And Freud just smiles faintly in the dark and says, "You will call it different."
You will call it different. That line hits like a ton of blocks. Let's pause and connect this directly to you, the listener. Have you ever sworn off a certain type of person? You go through a terrible breakup and you tell your friends, "I am never, ever dating an emotionally unavailable musician again. I am done with that."
No, I've heard that exact sentence.
And then 6 months later, you find yourself completely enamored with an emotionally unavailable graphic designer. You change the font, you change the aesthetic, but it is the exact same psychological clone.
Yeah.
You think it's different. But that is just your eye taking the car keys while your ego isn't looking.
It is the perfect illusion of progress, masking the reality of the loop. You think you are moving forward, but you are just walking a circle in the dark.
Yeah.
And this idea of being trapped in a recursive loop of our own unconscious making serves as a deeply profound bridge into the final and perhaps most surprising section of the author's work.
Yes, the afterword. Because the author, the mouse-colored cat, makes a massive conceptual leap here. They argue that just as individual humans are trapped in these psychological loops, our modern technological society is currently falling into the exact same trap.
Right. The afterword is titled Antidote to Algorithmic Inbreeding. And the author does something very transparent here. They admit right off the bat that this very book utilized large language models AI to come into existence.
But they don't praise the AI.
No, not at all. They describe these models as stochastic parrots of infinity that read everything and understand nothing.
Stochastic parrots of infinity. It's a poetic but brutal way to describe how AI works. It's just guessing the next most probable word based on vast amounts of data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the author points out a massive historical shift in how we view technology. Back in the 1980s or 90s, the great promise of digital technology was zero generation loss.
Right, like if you made a copy of a digital photo or a digital audio file, it was perfectly identical to the original. The fidelity was theoretically infinite, unlike a VHS tape that degrades every time you copy it.
But today, with the explosion of generative AI, the paradigm has shifted entirely. The danger we face now isn't the degradation of the visual or audio signal, it is the degradation of meaning itself.
How so?
The author introduces a concept that is currently keeping computer scientists awake at night. It's called digital autophagy.
Let's define that. Autophagy. Auto meaning self and phagy meaning eating. A system devouring itself.
Exactly. How do LLMs train? They scrape the internet for text. But increasingly, the text on the internet is being generated by other AIs. So the AI is feeding on its own outputs. It generates an article which gets published, which then becomes the training data for the next generation of the model.
Oh, wow.
As it forms these recursive self-eating loops, the concept known as model collapse occurs. The thought it produces becomes smoother, safer, more average, and entirely predictable with each iteration. It loses the edges.
By copying itself endlessly, the machine produces not intelligence, but conformity. It's like a psychic loop on a macro scale. If the human unconscious is trapped repeating its past traumas, the algorithm is trapped endlessly repeating the statistical average of human thought.
Yes.
So what is the antidote? How do we break the loop before culture just flattens into a gray paste?
The author introduces a philosophy of resistance they call capacitivism.
Oh, capacitivism.
This is a reference to another fictional text mentioned in the notes called Taylor Shrugged. The core tenet of capacitivism isn't to become a modern Luddite. We shouldn't throw our laptops in the river and reject AI entirely. We don't reject the digital photocopy. Instead, we overload it.
Let me push you on the mechanics of that. How exactly do you overload an algorithm that can process billions of parameters a second?
You introduce friction.
Yeah.
You introduce bizarre, irrational starks that the system's statistical models cannot possibly anticipate because there is no historical precedent for them. AI relies on probability. What is the most probable word to follow the previous word? As the author brilliantly puts it, there is no training data for Wittgenstein in a slammed door or Deleuze in lipstick.
Deleuze and lipstick. I love that so much. So by forcing the AI to process these impossible pairings, like forcing it to pair Taylor Swift's red scarf with Martin Heidegger's ontology of being.
Or forcing it to put the ruthless political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli into the passenger seat of a pop synth getaway car.
Exactly. The human user forces the machine off the statistical highway and onto strange, unmapped side roads.
This act of forcing incompatible ideas together is what the author calls conceptual vandalism. AI can organize existing information perfectly, and it can summarize flawlessly, but it cannot dare. It cannot take a leap of faith.
Only humans can do that.
Exactly. The conceptual leap, the vandalism of putting two totally disparate, highly charged things together to see what kind of friction they create, is a uniquely human act.
And that leads to a profound takeaway for all of us as we navigate this new, often overwhelming technological era. The text explicitly states, the citizen of tomorrow will not be the one who passively consumes the algorithmic flow, but the one who bends it.
I love that line.
Sovereignty in the digital age isn't about owning information anymore because the AI has all the information. Sovereignty is about your ability to disturb the AI's logic.
The author, the mouse-colored cat, has essentially demonstrated this philosophy by creating the book itself. They've taken the color of the mouse, slipped past the guards, and entered the machine. They use the algorithm as a tool to build an intellectual object that the algorithm alone would never ever have dared to assemble.
Because assembling it required a human sense of irony, humor, and irrationality, or as they might say, required a human cat.
Right.
And just to show the sheer scope of this conceptual vandalism, the back of the book lists the other titles in the Imagined Philo Swift collection. I just have to read these because they are incredible.
They're so good.
We've got You Belong With Me, paired with René Girard's theory of mimetic desire. Blank Space, paired with the psychoanalytic theories of Jacques Lacan. Cruel Summer, debated alongside the theology of Thomas Aquinas. And Teardrops on My Guitar, viewed through the deeply pessimistic lens of Arthur Schopenhauer. It is an absolute masterpiece of intellectual friction.
It really is. It completely validates the premise we started with. Philosophy does not have to exist in a sterile academic vacuum, and pop culture does not have to be mindless consumption. When you crash them together with enough velocity, you reveal the underlying hidden structures of both.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly winding, unexpected journey. We started this deep dive with a smirk, didn't we? The very idea of pairing a billionaire stadium pop star with the bearded, cigar-smoking father of 19th century psychoanalysis seemed absurd, almost like a punchline.
But by taking it seriously, by digging beneath the surface of both the music and the theory, we uncovered some genuinely profound truths.
We really did. We explored the invisible Freudian architecture of our own minds, the exhausted ego constantly trying to rebuild the white picket fence, while the superego waters the lawn for the neighbors and the Id runs around in the dark with the shears.
And we confronted the terrifying, ego-bruising illusion of romantic destiny, realizing that the compulsion to repeat often means we aren't actually falling in love with someone new. We're just unearthing an old, unresolved trauma and hoping for a different ending.
We fell into the same hole with better lighting. But crucially, we also discovered that this human messiness, this irrational repetition compulsion, might actually be our greatest superpower in the modern age.
Yeah.
It is exactly the human capacity to act irrationally, to make bizarre conceptual leaps, and to misbehave that serves as our best defense against the sterile, average, self-devouring conformity of artificial intelligence.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've discussed today, but taking it one step further.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we've spent this whole time talking about Freud's compulsion to repeat as a deeply personal romantic tragedy, the individual falling into those same relationship holes. But what if we zoom out from the individual to society as a whole?
Oh, wow. Looking at society itself as having a psyche?
Exactly. If the unconscious has no calendar, and humanity is fundamentally driven by this exact same Freudian architecture,
Hmm.
our political cycles, our endless cultural movements, even our wars, just these societies collectively urgently trying to resolve an unfinished historical trauma.
That is heavy.
Are we simply dressing up ancient unresolved human conflicts in new technology, setting them in new suburbs and desperately calling them different?
That is a chilling thought. We aren't just repeating our childhoods, we are unearthing the same historical scripts over and over again, completely unaware of the loop.
So the next time you read the news and feel overwhelmed, don't just ask what's new. Take a step back and ask yourself, where have I seen this script before?
That is a massive paradigm-shifting question to leave you with. Next time you find yourself standing in a stadium surrounded by 70,000 people, or just driving home alone late at night, remember that the X-ray machine for the human soul is broken. The muddy, chaotic waters of the unconscious are everywhere, even hiding in plain sight within a 3-minute pop song. Go out and misbehave creatively today, bend the algorithm with some conceptual vandalism, and we will be back next time with another stack of sources for a brand new deep dive.